Welcome back to Silicon Wafers. This episode, Ukraine's doomsday option. Despite the profusion of stories we've covered, the battle for Pokrovsk, energy sanctions, and so on, the most important strategic angle on the war this winter is the attritional energy war. And it is quite unlike the Western attitude to the war throughout all these 4 years of conflict to cede the escalation dominance to Russia at every turn, always pulling their punches in support for Ukraine and never allowing its ally to land a decisive knockout blow on Russia. Now Ukraine is taking off the gloves because below the nuclear threshold, there is nothing holding back Russia's viciousness and violence. Before we jump in, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee is especially important at this time as we gear up to run our final events of the year. If you can help, then it's massively appreciated through Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. Ukraine is seeking to inflict greater costs on Russia in the energy war than it can impose upon Ukraine. The escalation is the only way to make it clear to Putin he cannot win and is the only way to inflict economic and social costs that start to make Putin's brittle regime appear vulnerable to its own internal audience. Nothing else will get through to Putin. Nothing at all. So what is Ukraine's doomsday lever? Well, this episode suggests that it is hitting the Yamal network. Here is the myth versus the math. There is an inescapable logic to the course of this existential escalation for Ukraine's existence. It starts with testing the theory of imposing blackouts and heating denial to smaller, non-strategic Russian towns, Belgorod, Vladimir, Voronezh, and that is happening now. The next stage is to test supporting infrastructure around Moscow, electricity substations, energy supply routes for fuel, gas, and oil products. This is happening. Beyond that, there are substantial and extended blackouts in smaller towns, then Moscow and St. Petersburg. But that's not the final arrow in Ukraine's quiver. It has a doomsday option hitting Yamal Cross. If none of the other escalatory steps leads to an unconditional ceasefire, then I suggest it's a near certainty that we'll reach the doomsday stage for Moscow by the end of this winter. There has been chatter, of course, about a Ukrainian doomsday option to strike Russia's Yamal gas pipeline hub, but it has not received as much attention as perhaps it deserves. Sometimes called the Yamal Cross, it incorporates several gas lines, including the Yamal Europe natural gas pipeline, which is 4,107 kilometers long, that is 2,555 miles. The pipeline is connecting Russian natural gas fields in the Yamal Peninsula and Western Siberia with Poland and Germany via Belarus. The Polish portion ceased operating in 2022. In Gazprom's development project nomenclature, the pipeline consists of 4 sections. Bovonikovo Ukhta, which is 1,200 kilometers or 750 miles. Ukhta Torzhok, 970 kilometers or 600 miles. The western section from Torzhok, also confusingly named Yamal Europe, that is the 16,000 kilometers or 1,000 mile distant route. And the partly parallel SRTO Torzhok branch section, that is long at 2,200 kilometers, 1,400 miles. Europe hasn't relied on the Yamal Europe route since 2022, and all Russian gas transit via Ukraine ended on January 1st, 2025, when Kiev let the 5-year transit deal expire. Moscow has floated restarting transit in peace proposals, but Ukraine shut the spigot and alternative routes are limited. Turkstream is near capacity. Yamal Europe remains politically blocked. For a shorter-term hit and more impact on battlefield logistics, Ukraine needs to hit the fuel that the war machine actually burns, diesel and jet fuel, rather than the gas that Moscow barely sells westward anymore. However, some analysts have claimed that there is still extraordinary power in striking this fuel nexus within Russia's gas transit system at the Yamal Cross. It's enough to collapse Russia's economy, says military expert Oleg Zhdanov in relation to why Ukraine needs Tomahawk missiles and why they are unlikely to be supplied. He claims that a strike on the Yamal cross could alter the war's trajectory. Tomahawk missiles, which the US is being asked to supply to Ukraine, could collapse Russia's economy. In his view, a hit on the Yamal Cross, that nexus in northern Russia where 17 high pressure gas pipelines converge, would suffice, he says. This view was expressed to tsn.ua by Zhdanov. It's for this reason the analyst doubts the US will actually hand over Tomahawks. In his view, it's more in the character of a political bargaining chip by Trump, a way to exert pressure on the Kremlin to align with the outcomes that Trump wants to achieve rather than because of anything they can do to assist Ukraine to push back Russian aggression or to achieve a victory of any sort. But on the flip side, he said, if we hypothetically assume they did provide them, I'd say even 20 to 50 missiles. That figure floats in open sources. 20 could snuff out the Yamal cross in one go, and that would cripple Russia's entire energy sector, claims Oleg Zhdanov. Yamal Cross may not be operational in its entirety, but it still represents the strategic core of Russia's gas network. Zhdanov's contention that a coordinated strike on this node could collapse Russia's energy economy is the exact reason, he states, why the US will never greenlight these missiles for Ukraine. He states, because that is the main task. I said this at the very start of the war. The first is to guard against the collapse of the Russian Federation. Because that is the main task, he said. I said this at the very start of the war. The first to guard against the collapse of the Russian Federation will be the United States. Everyone fears this collapse. The Yamal Europe pipeline was highly strategically important as a major conduit for Russian natural gas supplies to Western Europe, but it is currently idle due to the geopolitical fallout from the war in Ukraine. The pipeline, with an annual capacity of 33 billion cubic meters, was one of the primary land-based routes for transporting natural gas from Russia's Yamal Peninsula to Poland and Germany, contributing significantly to Europe's energy security. The construction of the Yamal Europe pipeline, along with Nord Stream 1, provided Russia with alternative routes to supply gas to Western Europe, bypassing Ukraine and increasing its leverage in transit negotiations. The pipeline fostered significant economic ties and interdependence between Russia and European nations, with long-term contracts forming the basis of a major energy relationship for decades. Russia chose instead to use energy as a weapon and then to invade Ukraine. The pipeline has been idle since 2022 after a payment dispute led to Russia halting deliveries to Poland and subsequent sanctions and counter-sanctions on the Polish section's owner. The Polish section of the pipeline is now primarily used for reverse flow, transporting gas from Germany to Poland, supported by other diversification efforts like the Baltic Pipe, linking Poland to Norway. The war in Ukraine has fundamentally altered the European energy landscape. The EU is actively working to end its reliance on Russian fossil fuels by 2027 through diversification of supplies, for instance, LNG from the US and Qatar, and a transition to renewables, diminishing long-term strategic importance of traditional Russian pipeline routes. Hitting Yamal Cross could reinforce the policy and close down the future renewal or the potential to renew that supply. While the physical infrastructure remains, the political and commercial viability of the Yamal Europe pipeline as a major east to west supply route for Russian gas to Europe is currently non-existent, with the remaining operational pipeline being Turk Stream. In essence, while the infrastructure was built for major strategic importance, political developments have largely neutralized that role in the current European energy strategy. But Russia's domestic gas production is not solely dependent on the Yamal pipeline system, but the Yamal fields are a strategically important and growing source of gas for domestic consumption. The majority of Russia's domestic gas comes from a vast integrated network of fields and pipelines across the country, but Yamal Cross is that highest density node of supply in the system. Taking it down could trigger a cascade effect throughout that gas supply system. The Yamal Peninsula itself is a key strategic area for new development, with huge reserves to be tapped. As of 2020, the Yamal gas fields produced over 20% of Russia's natural gas, a share that was projected to increase. The gas from the Yamal fields is fed into Russia's Unified Gas Supply System, UGSS, a massive network of pipelines spanning over 158,000 kilometers, which serves the entire country. Gas from various fields is commingled and distributed throughout the system. While the Yamal Europe pipeline was a major export route to Europe, now largely halted due to sanctions and political disputes, the production fields in the Yamal region also supply the domestic market via that internal network. Russia has also diversified its infrastructure by building pipelines to China, Power of Siberia, and developing liquefied natural gas LNG projects such as the Yamal LNG terminal, which primarily serves export markets but further reduces reliance on any single pipeline for overall production and revenue. So there is another angle here. Future trade with Europe is threatened by a strike, but it would also emphasize to China the instability of such a potential supply partner for as long as the war persists and Russian aggression against Ukraine. It also means that the entire field is vulnerable and there are other targets such as the LNG project. But a spectacular attack on the Yamal pipelines inside Russia would bring diplomatic blowback and potential environmental risk for marginal short-term impact, at least on Putin's war machine, when compared to Ukraine's ongoing strike campaign against oil refineries, depots, and logistics, the part of Russia's energy complex that fuels tanks, jets, and budget cash flow. These will remain the first initial priorities of Ukraine's deep strike campaigns, but Yamal remains a potent threat to Russia, its prestige, the long-term viability of its energy economy. Perhaps a strike on Yamal is more potent, kept as a threat, than to be followed through with. Next, let's look at Ukraine's energy attrition strategy and how it is starting to bite. Ukraine's long-range drone and missile campaign keeps degrading Russian refineries and petrochemicals deep in Russia's rear. It's not just headlines. Throughput and exports are wobbling, and Z patriots, as well as regime analysts, have started to notice. This is from Reuters, September 1st. Recent Ukrainian drone attacks shut down facilities accounting for at least 17% of Russia's oil processing capacity. Independent and market analyses since August track sustained outages and throughput cuts at Volgograd, Ryazan, Novokubyshev, and more, pushing periodic fuel shortages and price spikes inside Russia while forcing costly workarounds. This is turning into a successful campaign with the option to scale the pressurizing strategy, cut refined fuel output, stress military logistics, and strain Russia's budget and war machine. Next, blackouts in Russia's borderland after Ukrainian strikes. Belgorod and Kursk. Local Russian officials say Ukrainian strikes knocked out power to tens of thousands of people. Belgorod Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov wrote that more than 20,000 residents are without electricity in the regional capital. A fire at the power plant in Kursk compounded these outages. That's from the Moscow Times. This mirrors Kiev's shift toward deep interdiction, aiming at Russia's war-supporting power nodes and grinding down air defense coverage by forcing it to protect numerous targets over a vast territory. Then there was a powerful secondary detonation. The Donetsk Shahid hub was hit. Ukraine says it struck a Shahid storage, assembly, and launch base at occupied Donetsk airport with drones and missiles. The General Staff reported a powerful secondary detonation, suggesting substantial stocks of munitions were cooked off. That's from the Kiev Independent, November 6th. A base of storage, assembly, and launch of Shahed-type UAVs and a powerful secondary detonation, so reports the Kiev Independent. That's months of Ukrainian intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance work paying off, neutralizing a hub that feeds Russia's long-range loitering munitions campaign against Ukraine. And continuing the theme of Ukrainian strikes against Russia, here's another one. Volgograd refinery halted after strike. Lukoil's Volgograd refinery halted operations following a Ukrainian drone strike with damage to the CDU-5 primary unit and hydrocracker, according to multiple industry sources. November 6th, Reuters. The plant has been stopped. CDU-5 was on fire, said Reuters. This is taking a big conversion unit offline, which hits diesel and jet yields, exactly the fuels Russia needs for war logistics. Such attacks, if they can be sustained, have major strategic implications. And more stuff is burning. Crimea fuel burns. Simferopol depot ablaze. In occupied Simferopol, the Krimnaft Ozburt oil depot erupted in flames after reported Ukrainian drone strikes overnight. November 6th, Ukrainian Special Ops released a video of hits on oil logistics targets across Crimea, according to the Kiev Post. The oil depot near Simferopol on fire after a drone attack, also reported Ukrinform. Why this matters? Well, Crimea remains a logistics spine for Russia's southern front. Repeated depot hits raise supply risk for air, naval, and ground operations. Then there was another strike on Bashkortostan, and this time it's petrochemicals, a deep strike in Russia's east. Agidol and aviation fuels were affected. Ukraine's military intelligence GUR said that long-range drones hit the Sterlitamark petrochemical plant over 1,000 kilometers from the border, targeting a workshop producing Agidol, an aviation fuel additive. That's on November 7th. The Kiev Independent could not independently verify all damage claims, but geolocated footage showed a major fire at source. That's in the Kiev Independent. Well, why we should care about this? Aviation-grade additives are linchpins for high-performance fuels. Disrupting niche chemicals multiplies pain across Russia's military-industrial output and deployment. Then there is rail sabotage. Partisans torch locomotives. Ukraine's GUR credits Russian anti-Kremlin partisans, that is the Freedom of Russia movement, with burning dozens of locomotives supplying the front. Even if the numbers of damaged trains are contested, the video verified patterns of railway sabotage that has grown through 2025. That's reported by Kiev Post. And if you haven't seen it, the videos are dramatic of burning Russian train rolling stock. The strategic effect is lower rail capacity and more pressure on the network, as well as the need to tighten security access across a vast rail network. In a war of logistical tonnage, transportation attrition can be as lethal as destroying a brigade on the battlefield. Well, as we get to the end of this episode, here is an important update. Ukraine secures winter gas, Orlen to deliver US LNG in early 2026. To stabilize winter energy security, Poland's Orlen and Naftogaz signed terms for more than 300 million cubic meters of gas sourced from the US LNG, with 3 cargoes slated for Q1 2026, regasified in Poland and piped to Ukraine. That was announced by Orlen.pl. Orlen will deliver over 300 million cubic meters of gas to its Ukrainian partner. That's from their press release. As Russia steps up grid attacks, import flexibility via Poland and the so-called vertical corridor initiative becomes a life support line throughout this heating season when it gets exceedingly cold in Ukraine. Well, that's reported by naftogaz.com. So what Ukraine hits and why? Here is the strategic piece of the episode. Zooming out, Kiev's deep strike doctrine has matured. Drones and precision missiles aim at oil refineries, depots, petrochemicals, rail power and drone hubs. Systems that have intense and lengthy repair times, low mobility, and big budgetary implications. This is distributed attrition at scale rather than a single doomsday blow. Even a Yamal cross strike is not a magic bullet, but it could have impact when combined with numerous other targets, such as the ones we've listed throughout this episode. Recent expert work, that is CSIS industry trackers, frame this as a modern operational art, operational military hybrid art across multiple domains. On the ledger, shuttered refinery units, according to Reuters, constrained product exports, periodic fuel rationing, and growing defense industrial friction. Meanwhile, Russia's own mass strikes on Ukraine's grid aim to invert the pain, forcing blackouts, slowing industry, sapping morale. We're going to be covering that side of it in a separate episode. Well, what to watch out for? Watch out for follow-on strikes against power nodes in Russia's border oblasts, Belgorod, Kursk, Voronezh, as Kiev pressures air defenses and energy logistics and starts doing trial attacks, building up to the big one, which is to install blackouts in Moscow itself. That's according to the Moscow Times. Expect refinery repair windows to lengthen as repeated hits compound their effect. Volgograd is a case in point, says Reuters. This same logic will start applying to electricity and thermal infrastructure in Russia as well. We should also track LNG intakes, routes via Poland, Lithuania, Greece, that keep Ukraine's gas-fired generation of energy and industry on life support this winter. It's now strategically vital to get these resources in. That is from Polskie Radio Online. And in conclusion, Ukraine's energy attrition play is working because it's cumulative and targeted. The Yamal doomsday option, some analysts suggest it's more of a PR exercise than a strategic endgame, but it would only come once so many other energy targets have been hit and eliminated that it would be a powerful signal that Russia has decisively lost the attritional energy war. It would also be a tremendous blow for Russia's future hopes of restarting its continental gas trade, with Europe a way of crippling Russia as a military and economic threat for many, many years to come.
Бажаємо міцного здоров'я. Ми бійці батальйону безпілотних систем Black Raven 93-ї бригади Холодний Яр виконуємо бойове завдання на Константинівському напрямку в Донецькій області. Для їх успішного виконання наш підрозділ має потребу в пікапах для виїзду особового складу на позиції, евакуації, своєчасного підвозу боєприпасів, дронів та обладнання в район ведення бойових дій. Звертаємося до YouTube-спільноти Silicon Curtain та Джонатана особисто з проханням допомогти підтримати збір, а також до Car for Ukraine та Бандера Мобіль з проханням допомогти з купівлею, підготовкою та доставкою авто на фронт. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!